In today's video, we are starting a brand new series, and that is me giving you a beginner's guide to setting up workflows with the Webflow CMS. So without further ado, let's get into it. Welcome back to the channel. So in this video today, we are going to be starting a brand new series where I am going to teach you how to set up workflows when sending data to the Webflow CMS. So I have made video on this channel explaining how I set up workflows for platforms like the Unicorn Factory, but I wanted to create this particular series here to basically give anyone who is brand new to setting up workflows and automation a little bit of an overview of how exactly you structure your workflows, how you can map specific fields to the Webflow CMS, and basically make it easier for you to get a good understanding of how you can automate workflows when you are working inside of Webflow. So there's a lot to uncover when it comes to working with the Webflow CMS in tools like Integromat or Zapier. So I am going to lay everything out to you, but in order to make it a little bit more digestible, I've broken it down into multiple videos. In this first video, we're going to have a bird's eye view of what you can actually do inside of Integromat or Zapier when working with the Webflow CMS. So we're going to go over the different action types that are available to us. And once we have gone over those action types that basically allow you to send data to or from the Webflow CMS, I'm going to show you how I structure my workflows for creating Webflow CMS items and updating Webflow CMS items. I'm also going to dive into what I believe is the best tool to use when it comes to updating and creating Webflow CMS items, and I'm going to dive specifically into what I am using at the very end of the video, so definitely stick around to the end. So one suggestion that I do have for this series is to actually build along to some of the workflows that I'm setting up inside of Zapier or Integromat so that you get a basic understanding of how the Webflow CMS and tools like Airtable work together. And if you have any questions along the way, please drop them into the comment section below, because I am going to be making a bonus video at the end of this series where I'm basically going to be doing a Q&A addressing certain issues or concerns that might come up along the way. With all of that being said, I highly recommend using the timestamps in the videos because these videos are going to be a little bit longer. I'll make it easier to navigate that way. And then also, before we get into it, smash that subscribe button if you want to be updated when the new videos for this series come out. And also, if you are enjoying this video, please also smash that like button. But with all that being said, let's get into it. Okay, so the first thing that we're going to go over is what you can actually do with the Webflow CMS. Now, there are a lot of different automation tools that you can use in order to send data to the Webflow CMS, but I'm going to be focusing on the two most commonly used one, which are Zapier and Integromat. Now, the first thing that we're going to do is we are going to go and add the Webflow steps so that we can actually see what each automation tool allows us to do. And so we're going to start off inside of Zapier, and we can see in here that when we select our action event, we have a few different options. First of all, we have the create item option, then we have the create live item option, then we have the update item option, and then we have the update live item option. We also have a few e-commerce specific actions that you can use, but I'm not going to be diving into this in this series only because I don't use Webflow e-commerce very often, but the principles that I'm going to be explaining for the Webflow CMS workflows will apply to the e-commerce workflows as well. Now I'm going to be diving into what each action step means, but before we do that, let's have a quick look at what we can do with the Webflow CMS inside of Integromat. And as you can see, there are a few additional options that are currently not available inside of Zapier. So for example, we have the list items action, we have the get items action, the create item action, update and delete item action. We also have a whole bunch of additional steps that allow us to do various things like get list collections or to get other types of information that we might need in order to set up workflows. I am going to be diving into some of the additional actions in a future video, but for now, what we need to know is that the main functions that you can do with the Webflow CMS is to create an item, update an item, and in the case of Integromat, they also allow us to delete an item. Now, returning to Zapier, we can also see that there's a difference between create item and create live item, as well as update item and update live item. Now, the main difference between the two is that whenever you run the create live item action step or the update live item action step, all of the changes that were made through this workflow will automatically be published to your Webflow site without you having to manually republish the changes that happened inside of your CMS. So next up, we're going to go over how I structure workflows where I send data to Webflow or I update items inside of Webflow. But in order for us to do that, we're going to need to understand what different fields are required in order to run certain workflows. And we're going to start off with the create live item or create item step in both Zapier and Integromat. Now, if we jump down into the step where we set up our item inside of Webflow, we can see that the required fields inside of Zapier are actually specified. And you can see here that the required field is the name field, as well as the archived or draft field. And if we jump into Integromat, you will see that the same rule applies for creating items inside of Webflow, even if you're using Integromat. So all the other fields that you have set up inside of your Webflow CMS collection are optional. You are, however, going to have to set the name field as well as the archived and draft field. One additional note that I'd say about Integromat is that you may have noticed that inside of Zapier, you have the create item or create live item option. Integromat basically pulls that all together by allowing you to either set your item to being live or not being live in the create item step. Okay, now let's look at the next action step that is commonly used, which is to update an item or update a live item inside of Webflow. Now, the same rule applies for updating live items. You are still going to need to populate the name field as well as the archived and draft field. But in the case of updating an item inside of Webflow, you also need to specify the item ID. And the item ID basically tells Webflow what item inside of your Webflow CMS collection you want to update. And this rule also applies in any other automation tool. So if we look inside of Integromat, you can see that you need to actually specify the specific record that you want to update. And this makes sense because obviously if we are going to tell the Webflow CMS that we want to update an item, we also need to specify what item we want to update. And this is typically where people get tripped up. And that is because when they create new CMS items, they don't actually store the item ID that is required in order to update a Webflow item. So I'm going to be showing you how I structure my workflows in a way that allows me to automatically store these item IDs so that you can then later on update or delete Webflow CMS items by referencing the item ID that you stored when you created your Webflow CMS item. Now, before I show you how I structure the create item and update item workflows inside of Zapier and Integromat, I did quickly want to touch on the delete item step that is currently only available inside of Integromat. And what you can see here is that you're going to need to specify the collection ID and the item ID. So in the case of you using this delete step, you are also going to have to store the collection ID somewhere so that you can then later on reference it in this particular step inside of Integromat. Okay, so now let's get into structuring workflows, and we're going to start off with the create a new item inside of Webflow step. Now, one thing that you're going to need to set up in order to run this workflow is a trigger event, and typically the trigger event is where your source of information is going to be. Now, you can use Google Sheets, you can use Notion, you can use whatever you want. I use Airtable because Airtable has a whole bunch of features that comes in super handy when you want to do things like send multi-reference or single reference fields from Airtable to Webflow. But again, it's a preference thing. I definitely think that if you are uncertain as to what source of information you should use, definitely use Airtable. I think it's hands down the best database tool that you can use for use cases like this. Now, the first thing that we're going to have to do is to create our table and to create all of the corresponding fields. Now, I've created a collection inside of Webflow called the tags collection, and just to keep things simple, I've only populated the required fields. So what we're going to do first is we are going to jump into our Airtable base and create our table. Now, since the only field that is required is the name field, I can actually just stick with this, but I am going to have to create two additional fields that are going to be super important later on for when we update CMS items. And the field that we want to add is the Webflow ID field. So simply add a single line text and call it Webflow ID, and then just go ahead and add another one, which was also a single line text called the slug. Now, what we're going to be doing with these fields is we're actually going to store our Webflow item ID that is created when we send this information to Webflow, and we're also going to store our slug in case we want to create preview links inside of Airtable. Another thing that I highly recommend doing when working inside of Airtable or any other database tool for that matter is to create a separate view that you can use to control when a workflow is triggered. Now, you can see here that I currently have have a record in here, but whenever I add a new record and I make this particular table the source of the trigger, then it will automatically create the record as soon as I have added this record, whereas I might want to first of all review it and then approve it. So I recommend creating a separate table or a separate view by clicking on Grid View on the bottom left, and then simply applying a filter to that view where the status of this record is ready for Webflow. Now, whenever a new record is added, you can automatically switch it into review mode, and you'll see that at the moment no record sits inside of this view. And the reason why no record is sitting inside of that view is because the status of both of these records is currently set to review. But as soon as we switch it over to ready for Webflow, you'll see that this record has now moved into this brand new view, and we can now use this view as a trigger event inside of Zapier or inside of Integromat. So this is actually one of many reasons why I definitely recommend using Airtable as your database tool. It allows you to do things like setting up separate views that you can then control to set up certain workflows, but there are a whole bunch of additional things that I'll be showing you in future videos. Now, when you set up this workflow, you'll be able to select the Airtable app, you'll be able to select your table, which in my case is Webflow tags, and then you can limit the trigger event to a specific view, and we are obviously going to be using the one that we just set up as the ready for Webflow view. So we're going to simply click into that, and as soon as we click into that, we can now test our trigger, and it's now going to go and see what records sit inside of this table. And we can see here now that the record that currently sits in our view right here, the red record, has now been retrieved by Zapier, and we can now map the information that we got from this particular step to our Webflow action. Okay, and so if you've never used an automation tool like this before, it is absolutely magical. All you need to do is just go ahead and select your tables and your collections, and then what you can do is you can simply specify what you want in all of your different fields by clicking into it and then simply selecting the values that you got from your previous step. And so in this case, it's when we got a new record into our Airtable view, and now I know that I want to populate the red field into the name field inside of my Webflow collection. So all I need to do is just click on this value and I am good to go. Now again, we know now that the name field is required, the slug field is optional, and I actually recommend leaving it empty so that Webflow can automatically generate a slug for you. And this is kind of important only because it will cause errors if you try to recreate the same record with the same slug. So I just recommend leaving this empty. But we do know that we need to switch our archived and draft mode to false so that it is automatically published on our live website. So what we're going to do is we're going to go ahead and click the continue button, and then we're going to click on test and continue. Now you'll see that a message comes up that says a item was sent to Webflow just now, as well as a whole bunch of information. Now before we dive into this information, one thing that we're going to do is we're going to navigate our way over to our CMS, and we're going to go ahead and refresh it. So we can see now that our red Webflow tag has been added, which is fantastic. That means that we know that our workflow works, but it doesn't stop here. So the next thing that we're going to have to do is we are going to have to take the item ID that was generated, as well as the slug that was generated, and we have to store these values inside of our Airtable base so that we can then later on use these values to update items inside of Webflow. So the way that we're going to do that is we're actually going to add another step down here, which is the Airtable step. And what we're going to do here is we're going to choose update item as our action event. Now, as soon as you've connected your base and your table, now what we're going to have to do is specify what Airtable record we actually want to update. And so we know that the record that we want to update is the record that we moved into our ready for Webflow view. And the cool thing about this workflow is that we have actually referenced this record in the first step. So if we go back to our trigger event, we can actually see that we have the Airtable record ID for the record that we want to update that we can now reuse in this step here. So if you click on the record field, you'll be able to see that you can select two options from the dropdown. Now, you don't want to select any of these options because whenever you run this workflow, it will always reference the same Airtable record that you select out of these two. So what we need to do is we need to make this record value dynamic. And the way that we can do that is by clicking on custom and then navigating our way to the first step of our workflow, which is the trigger event inside of Airtable, and then simply referencing the ID field, which is populated with the Airtable ID. And as soon as we have populated that, we are now able to update this record, so the record that currently sits in the Ready for Webflow view, with our Webflow ID and our slug. And so how we're going to do that is we're going to navigate our way down to the field that says Webflow ID. We're going to click into it, and now we're going to navigate our way down to the step where the Webflow item is created. So now when you click into it, you can just click on show all options, and you'll see that down here there's a field called ID, and what we want to do is simply click into it, and then we are good to go. We also want to do the same thing with the slug field. So we're going to navigate our way back to the second step where the slug is created, and we're now going to simply click on this field here. Now, an additional thing that you might want to do is to also update the status of this particular record from Ready for Webflow to Live in Webflow, since this record is now inside of Webflow. And so the way that we can do that is we can actually navigate our way up, and in the status field, instead of populating it with a dynamic value, we can actually just type in Live in Webflow. And the reason why we don't need to use a dynamic value at this step is because we know that whenever this action step runs, the item will be live in Webflow as we have just created it in the previous step. So you don't always need to use dynamic values when you are setting up these workflows, and this is a great example of where you might want to use a static value. So what we want to do now is we want to simply click on continue, and now what we want to do is we want to click on test and continue. And we'll now see that a record was sent to Airtable. And if we now navigate our way back to Airtable and we click on the grid view, you'll see that the record has now changed from Ready for Webflow to Live in Webflow. And we can also now see that our Webflow ID as well as our slug have been populated. Now, it's absolutely crucial that you add the update record in Airtable step when you create the Webflow CMS item, because if you don't store the slug or the item ID, you will not be able to update the Webflow CMS item inside of Zapier or Integromat. So just as an example, if we head over to Integromat where we now have to reference what item we want to work with, we are going to have to specify it with a dynamic value, and the dynamic value that we are going to need to use is the item ID that we are now storing inside of the Airtable base. And so it is absolutely crucial that whenever you create a new Webflow item ID, that you store it inside of a separate table with the Webflow ID as well as the slug. And specifically with also deleting Webflow items inside of Integromat, you might also want to store the collection ID that you can also find inside of the step when the live item is created. And so you can see that right here, so that you can then later on reference the collection ID as well. So if we have a quick look into how I would structure this workflow inside of Integromat, you can see here that we have our Airtable trigger event, then we also have our create item inside of Webflow, and then we have our update our Airtable record step. And so the principles of setting up these workflows is going to be the same in any automation tool. One thing that I'd say about Integromat is that the new trigger in view step isn't as good as inside of Zapier. So Zapier pretty much triggers as soon as a record gets moved into a view, and please keep in mind that there might be a slight delay based on the type of plan that you're on. But inside of Integromat, it runs on a schedule, which is not always super convenient when it comes to running these workflows immediately, which is why I typically use my trigger event as a webhook and then use a lookup. But I don't want to dive into too much detail into how all of that works in this video, just to keep things simple. But just know that my trigger event inside of Integromat for a workflow like this is typically a webhook. Okay, so if at this point you are worried that you haven't been storing your Webflow item ID or your slug anywhere, then don't worry. I'm going to be making a video showing you how you can actually retrieve those item IDs if you haven't been storing them. But for now, what we're going to do is we're going to look into the next workflow that is commonly used when sending data to the Webflow CMS, which is how to structure a workflow when you are updating an item inside of Webflow. Okay, so if you have been storing your Webflow ID in your database tool, then the update the Webflow item ID workflow is arguably easier, but there is one additional field that we are going to have to set up in Airtable in order for us to be able to trigger this workflow, and that is the last modified time field. So what we're going to do is we're going to start off by creating our trigger, which is similar to when we created our first workflow, which is to create a Webflow item. And so what we need to do now is just add our last modified time field. So what we're going to do is we're going to navigate our way back to our Airtable table, and we're going to now look for a new field type called last modified time. Now, in the last modified time field, you will have the option to specify only certain fields triggering the new updated time. So if you only want this last modified time to update whenever someone changes the status field, then you can just simply jump in here and specify that you only want to work with the status field. But in my case, I'm actually going to be triggering this workflow when a record is moved into a new view, which is why I'm going to leave on all editable fields for now. So I'm going to simply create this field, and then what I am going to do is I am going to navigate my way back to Zapier, and I am now going to select the last modified field that I created. Now again, we're going to need to select a view, or at least we don't need to, but I highly recommend setting it up like this. And what we're going to do is we are going to create a view, which is update in Webflow view. And so what we can do now again is filter it out by specific conditions being met. So if we click on status, we can select any of these here. Now we know that we currently don't have a workflow that basically updates inside of Webflow. So what we're going to do is we're going to add a new status field called update in Webflow. So I'm going to make this blue, and I'm going to call this update in Webflow. And then when I set my filters for this view, what I'm going to do is I'm going to specify it as update in Webflow. And so next, if I want to go ahead and say change this particular record here from say red to pink, then all I need to do is just click on update in Webflow, and we can now use this particular view here as the trigger event for our update item in Webflow workflow. So what we're going to do is we're going to click into it, and you can see down here that we now have the update in Webflow view available to us. And if we click into it and we go and test it, we can see that the record has now been moved into this view. So let's say we want to now update the name of our Webflow item from red to pink. We've now made that change inside of Airtable. All we need to do now is send those updates to Webflow. So what we're going to do is we're going to select our app, Webflow. We're going to select our item event as update live item because we want those changes to be published immediately. And then what we're going to do is we are going to select our account. And once we've connected our site and our collections, now what we have to do is populate the item field with our Webflow item ID. And so the way that we can find our Webflow item ID is by clicking on show all options, and we'll be able to see that we actually can access all of the fields for this particular record. And you can see down here that we have our Webflow item ID field that we're going to click on. And that means that now we are referencing this particular record inside of Webflow. So what we want to do now is we want to now update our name field with the new name field that we added. So we're just going to simply map that, and whatever fields you want to update, I highly recommend just mapping them all up. And then we're going to switch our status from archive false to draft false. Now, one thing that I do want to tell you before we update this is that whatever slug was set, so in our case now it's red, won't be updated unless you specify it in here. But one word of warning about updating your slug is that people might not find this page because you haven't set up a redirect for it, which is why I typically recommend just leaving the slug as it is. And so what we're going to do now is we're going to simply click on continue, and we are now going to click on test and continue, and we will now see that the item was sent to Webflow. And so what we're going to do now is we're going to go ahead and refresh our Webflow CMS collection, and we can now see that that record has been updated to pink, but please keep in mind that the slug is still red. And so that is how we set up the workflow that updates the item inside of Webflow. Now you can theoretically stop here, but one thing that I always recommend doing if you are making changes to the status field, as we have made in here, is to simply update this record in Airtable to reflect the latest status. So in our case, what we want to do is we want to change our status from update in Webflow to live in Webflow. So simply connect your accounts, and then again use the custom step to specify the item that you want to update inside of Airtable. And again, all the Airtable records start with REC, and then just type in the status field live in Webflow, then just test and continue. And now if we jump back into our Airtable base, you can see that our status has been returned to live in Webflow, and we are now good to go. So all you need to do is turn on the Zap, and you've now set up a workflow that creates an item inside of Webflow as well as updates an item inside of Webflow. And then to just quickly show you how you can update an item through Integromat, again, all you really need to do is define your trigger event and then connect it to Webflow in the same way as we did inside of Zapier. And you can see in here now that you can select whatever item you want from the drop down field. But what we will want to do is we will want to map a field by the Webflow item ID, and so we can simply select the Webflow item ID by clicking into there, and that will then become dynamic, and you can then just go ahead and update your fields with whatever values you want to allow this workflow to update. Okay, so if you've made it this far, then good on you. Now I do want to quickly tell you a bit about what I'm doing at the moment when it comes to creating and updating items inside of Webflow. So I got started with Zapier, and I still think that Zapier definitely has better trigger events. So if you are already on one of the higher plans, then there's only a 2-minute lag for a record moving into a specific view and then creating or updating an item inside of Webflow, which absolutely worked for me in the early days. But Integromat, on the other hand, has a bit more flexibility when it comes to the actual complexity of workflows that you can set up. So if, for example, you want to create different paths, then even though you can do that inside of Zapier, Integromat just offers a lot more variety. And one thing that I've also found with Integromat is that they typically have more thorough integrations with apps, as you could see with the Webflow app. For example, you can also do things like update a Webflow item. You can also retrieve items inside of a collection, and you can retrieve entire collections, which can be quite handy if you do plan on having more complex workflows. With all of that being said, I actually use neither these days to create or update items inside of Webflows. Instead, I use Airtable automations and Airtable scripts. So Airtable scripts is a feature that you can use inside of Airtable to set up automations and workflows that allow you to connect to APIs like the Webflow API. Now with Airtable scripts, you can set up the exact same workflows that you can set up inside of Zapier or Integromat, with the exception that you really get the best of both worlds. For starters, setting up scripts inside of Airtable allows you to run the workflow significantly faster, meaning that there's actually no delay at all between you making an update to a record or approving a record to be created inside of Webflow. As soon as you have made the approval, the workflow automatically runs. Another thing that's really great about Airtable scripts is because you are writing actual code, you just get as much flexibility as you would get inside of Integromat, if not more. For example, if Zapier doesn't have a step for deleting a Webflow item inside of the native Webflow integration, then you can actually just use the Webflow API docs to basically create your own script that deletes Webflow items. Now, of course, writing scripts is definitely more complicated than setting up simple workflows inside of tools like Zapier or Integromat. So if you are brand new to setting up workflows and automations, I definitely recommend starting out inside of Zapier and then moving up to Integromat as soon as you're familiar with those trigger and action steps. But if you have gotten to the point where you followed along with this entire video, you've got a good understanding of how you would structure a workflow, then it might make sense to look into how to script. And we have actually set up a community called Code Meets No Code that shows you exactly how to do that. So in Code Meets No Code, we have a series of videos that you can follow along to that will show you exactly how you can create a script inside of Airtable automations and Airtable scripts that allow you to create, update, and delete items inside of Webflow. Now, besides being able to learn how to write scripts, we've also made all of our scripts available for you to simply copy and paste out into your own Airtable base, which is the ultimate time saver. And so that will allow you to set up workflows without you having to pay for tools like Zapier or Integromat. Another thing that is really awesome about Code Meets No Code is besides learning about tools like the Webflow CMS, there are also a whole bunch of other tools that you can learn. For example, how to work with the Stripe API. And you'll also get access to an awesome community of people who are currently working in the low code space. So if you want to connect with like-minded no coders and low coders, then this community is for you. And so that is the end of the first episode in this series. In the next episode, what we're going to be doing is going over the different field types when we send data to the Webflow CMS. So I'm going to show you how you have to set up Airtable in order to send the right field type to a Webflow. And so if you are not already subscribed to this channel, then subscribe to the channel so you get notified as soon as that video is live. And if you did get value out of this video, I would also very much appreciate if you could smash the like button and share this video with friends who might also be working with the Webflow CMS. Other than that, I want to thank you so much for sticking around for this entire video, and I'll see you back for the next one.